I'm Marissa Langley, 34 years old, and I still remember the weight of the wine glass in my hand when my father called me useless in front of everyone. The dining room was filled with clinking silverware and the low murmur of a roast beef dinner, but his voice cut through it all like a sharp wind. My mother didn't flinch, only nodded, sipping her Chardonnay, while my younger brother chuckled. Still renting that place, he added loud enough for the cousins to hear. They laughed, and I could feel the burns settle in my chest. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood, adjusted my napkin, and said, "Enjoy your dinner." And then I walked out, heels clicking against the tile, leaving their laughter behind. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove your worth when someone thought you didn't matter. I grew up in the same house my parents still live in, a colonial with green shutters, tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. My father, Walter, owned a small chain of appliance stores, and my mother, Caroline, managed the books once we were older. Our family motto, though never spoken aloud, was to work hard, stay quiet, and put family first. I did all three. I worked my way through college, graduated with a degree in finance, and had a shot at grad school. I even got accepted to Columbia. But that year the business hit a wall. Dad's accounts were in the red, and they came to me, told me they needed help. I gave them everything I had. $60,000 I'd saved from years of summer internships, tutoring, and night shifts at the campus library. I said goodbye to Columbia without much of a fight. In return, they told me they'd pay me back as soon as things picked up. What came instead were new office chairs, catered events, and a brand new SUV for Derek when he landed his first job. No mention of the money I'd poured into keeping the lights on. I didn't complain, not then. I convinced myself it was what family did. But that belief started to wear thin when I found myself at 28, trying to start something of my own. A simple budgeting app for small businesses. I shared the idea with Derek over coffee one weekend. A week later, $15,000 disappeared from my account. The bank traced it to his. He never denied it, just said he needed it more than I did and that I shouldn't be so dramatic. When I brought it to my parents hoping for some support or at least acknowledgement, my mother sighed and said, "He's your brother. Let it go." My father nodded like it was nothing at all. I swallowed my pride and moved on again. But some things don't go away. They stay buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. That dinner, the one where they all laughed at me like I'd never done a thing worth mentioning, was the moment everything snapped into place. I went home that night and sat in the dark, staring at the same walls I'd come back to again and again. I thought about the money, the chances I gave up, the silence I endured. And then I picked up my phone and called Tom. He didn't ask if I was overreacting. He just listened. And then he asked one question that changed everything. "What's your next move?" Pamela picked up on the second ring. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer, but her voice hadn't changed, calm, crisp, always 3 steps ahead. We caught up briefly, just enough to brush the dust off the past, and then I asked her plainly, "Can you help me look into something?" I gave her the name of my father's business, Langley Home and Appliance, and told her I had a reason to believe things weren't as stable as they looked. Pamela didn't ask many questions, just promised she'd get back to me soon. When she hung up, I sat at the edge of my bed, hands folded, eyes locked on nothing in particular. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew I needed the truth. 2 days later, her name popped up on my phone while I was at work. I stepped into the hallway, heart pounding. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "Marissa, it's bad." She went on to explain that 5 years ago, my parents had taken out a $200,000 loan using their Main Street building as collateral. It was worth around $4 million at the time, but they'd been missing payments for months now. The bank had started the foreclosure process. If they didn't come up with the money soon, the building would go up for auction. I leaned against the wall, letting the numbers sink in. That building wasn't just an office. It was their pride, the centerpiece of every holiday story they told about their so-called success. I remembered sitting in that same building as a kid, coloring behind the front desk, while my dad held court with customers and vendors. He always talked about owning it outright, like it was proof he'd made it. But now it was a facade, and behind it everything was falling apart. Pamela added that suppliers had stopped getting paid, and some checks had bounced more than once. They'd been hiding it well, but it wasn't going to last much longer. I thanked her, promised to grab lunch soon, and hung up. For a while I just stood there staring at the linoleum tiles under my shoes. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the way they had lied, all while looking down on me. That building had been the backdrop to every story where I was the afterthought. Now it was the crack in their image, and I could use it. That night I pulled out an old notebook and started writing. Questions mostly. Could I buy the building before it hit public auction? Was there any way to do it quietly? I had savings, years of living small, investing smart, and never relying on anyone else. But it wouldn't be enough on its own. Still, I knew I had options, and more importantly, I knew people. A name came to mind almost immediately: James Reed. He was a quiet, strategic type, sharp with contracts and discreet with clients. My old mentor had once described him as the kind of man who could buy a building without ever leaving a fingerprint. I called his office the next morning and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. His office sat on the 14th floor of a glass and steel high-rise in downtown Hartford, all clean lines and soft lighting. When I walked in, he greeted me with a firm handshake and a neutral smile. I laid it all out, everything from the loan to the foreclosure timeline, even the fact that it was my family's building. "I want to buy it," I said, "but I don't want them knowing it's me." He didn't blink. "We'll set up a shell company," he said. "Something clean and quiet, Riverbend Capital." He explained that based on the building's default status, the bank might accept $3 million, maybe even a little less. I told him I had just under $800,000 I could put up immediately. He nodded and slid a name across the desk: Brian Coleman. "Real estate investor," James said. "If he sees potential in the property, he'll front the rest." By that evening, I was sitting across from Brian Coleman at a cafe near the river. He was in his late 50s, eyes, sharp sleeves rolled clearly, used to moving money around with speed and precision. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to make the numbers speak. He studied the location, the market value, the state of the loan, and finally leaned back. "I'll put in $2.2 million," he said. "But I want a 10% cut of the rental income." I agreed. I would have agreed to more. We shook on it, and his team started the paperwork. Within 72 hours, Riverbend Capital submitted a formal offer. The bank accepted it without hesitation. Just like that, I owned the building, at least on paper, and no one knew it was me. A few days later, I took a detour on the way home from work and drove by the property. The lights were on. Music drifted out through the open windows, and I could hear laughter rising over the sound of a clinking glass. Another party. Another celebration. My mother always wore her best jewelry for those nights, and Derek would glide through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands and making promises. I parked across the street and watched them move through the space like they still owned it. They had no idea that every light in that building now ran through my name. The next morning, I mailed out the first lease amendment. As the new landlord, Riverbend Capital, was increasing their rent from $3,000 to $6,000 a month effective immediately, I knew it would hit hard. But that was the point. 2 days later, the buzzer rang while I was having coffee. I opened the door, and there they were, my father, mother, and Derek, standing like a wall in the hallway, holding the lease notice like it was a court summons. My father's voice boomed. "You did this, didn't you?" My mother's eyes were cold, her voice sharper than I remembered. "Only you would pull something this petty." Derek didn't bother to hide his disgust. "You're sabotaging us." I stepped aside and let them in. They filled the living room with their outrage, my father pacing my mother, sitting rigid on the edge of the couch. "You know we can't afford this," she said. "You know we're stretched thin." I crossed my arms and let them talk. When they slowed, I asked, "Why should I help?" Derek rolled his eyes. "That money? That was years ago. Get over it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just looked at him and said, "Like I should get over the 15,000 you stole from me." The room went quiet. My mother looked down at the floor. My father didn't say a word. They'd never acknowledged it, never even pretended it mattered. I walked to the door and opened it. "I'm not your safety net anymore. You'll need to figure it out." They left without another word. Later that evening, my phone started buzzing Facebook alerts notifications tags. Derek had written a post accusing me of turning my back on the family. My mother shared it. My father chimed in. There were comments from people I hadn't heard from in years, most of them siding with them, calling me selfish, ungrateful, bitter. I turned off my phone and closed the laptop. The building was mine, and the next time they tried to put on a show for their investors, I'd be their front row center. The Facebook posts kept coming for 2 days straight. Derek's was the first long and dramatic, written like some kind of open letter about betrayal and loyalty. My mother reshared it with a comment about family values, and my father followed with a photo from one of their old company events captioned with something vague about disrespect from within. I saw former neighbors liking the posts, people I hadn't spoken to since high school. The comments rolled in judgmental familiar, most of them leaning their way. I didn't respond to any of it. I just read them once, let the sting settle, and powered everything off. That weekend, I drove to the building on Main Street and parked across from it again. It was early afternoon. The sun hit the windows just right, casting long shadows through the glass onto the sidewalk. I sat there for a while looking at the place I used to walk through after school with a juice box in one hand and a math workbook in the other. Now I held the keys to it technically and legally, and my family had no idea what was coming. They had a big event scheduled for the following Thursday. Pamela had mentioned it offhand when she sent over the closing paperwork, something about a grand reopening. New investors, new product line, a glossy relaunch to keep up appearances. The timing was perfect. I already had the lease agreement drawn up and signed. They were officially in default. They just didn't know it yet. I spent the next few days gathering what I needed. A copy of the lease amendment, the proof of purchase from Riverbend Capital, the notice of rent, default, all of it neatly organized in a simple black folder. I didn't tell Tom the full plan, only that I had to attend something and that it might get a little uncomfortable. He nodded and offered to come with me, but I said no. I needed to do this on my own. The night of the reopening, I got ready like I was going to a formal gala. I chose a black dress, clean structured, nothing flashy. I pulled my hair back, kept the jewelry simple. When I stepped out of the car that evening and walked toward the building, the valet offered to take my keys, assuming I was another invited guest. I gave him a polite nod and walked in without a word. The room was crowded full of voices and music, the kind of gathering where everyone's glass is half full, and the air smells faintly of champagne and floor polish. My father stood near the entrance greeting guests as they arrived, shaking hands and making small talk like he always did. My mother stood further back near a buffet table talking to someone in a navy blazer. Derek was in constant motion, smiling, laughing, leaning in a little too close when he spoke. I stayed along the wall, unnoticed, moving slowly toward the center of the room. About 20 minutes in, my father tapped a glass with a spoon. The room quieted. He raised his voice just enough to carry across the floor. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "We're thrilled to welcome you to a new chapter of Langley Home and Appliance. Tonight's not just a party, it's a promise." There was polite applause. He lifted his glass. "To new beginnings." That's when I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice, just cleared my throat. It was enough. Heads turned. My father's hand froze mid-toast. My mother's smile dropped. Derek blinked twice and looked around, trying to understand why everyone had suddenly gone quiet. I held the black folder against my side and looked straight at my father. "I'm Marissa Langley," I said, And through Riverbend Capital, I own this building. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was exact. You could hear the soft shift of someone's heels on the marble. I opened the folder and removed one page, the lease default notice. You haven't paid your new rent. You're in violation of the lease. You're being evicted. There were no gasps, just quiet disbelief, the kind that takes a second to catch up with. My father lowered his glass without speaking. My mother looked between us like she'd missed a step in a conversation. Derek shook his head once, then took a step forward. "This is a joke," he said, trying to smile. "You can't just, 'You stole $15,000 from my account,'" I said, holding his gaze. "You used it for your startup, then laughed when it failed, and our parents covered for you, told me to let it go." That part drew a few reactions, nothing loud, just a ripple of discomfort through the guests. I looked around at the crowd. They've built their lives on money I gave up, on opportunities I walked away from. And last week, they stood in my apartment and called me petty. My father's face flushed. "Marissa, we can talk about this later." "No," I said. "We've been talking about it later for 10 years. My mother reached for his arm. Her voice was quiet now. "Let's go." They didn't argue after that. They turned slowly and walked out. Derek followed, pausing once to glance back, but no one moved to support him. The guests made a path as they left eyes down drinks untouched. I stood there for a moment, then walked to the door. No one stopped me. No one said a word. Outside, the wind had picked up a little. I didn't turn back. The building sat quiet the next morning. I walked past it on my way to grab coffee just to see if they'd come back. The lights were off. The parking lot, usually full during the work week, held just one car near the corner. A faded Langley home and appliance banner flapped weakly above the front door, its corners curling in the early spring wind. There were no deliveries, no music playing, no foot traffic. The silence didn't feel triumphant. It just felt still. By the end of that week, word had spread. A former coworker from the finance department messaged me privately to say most of the staff had quit. The investors, the same ones who were sipping champagne and listening to toasts just days earlier, had pulled out, some without saying a word, others with emails citing instability and concerns about leadership. I didn't respond to the message. I just closed the window and turned back to my screen. 3 months passed. The bank moved quickly. Without new capital, my parents couldn't meet their outstanding obligations. Their final supplier contracts were canceled, and one by one, each of their other locations followed the same pattern. By June, Langley Home and Appliance had filed for full closure. I read about it on the state business portal, no formal announcement, no apology letter, just a notice of dissolution and a list of pending claims. The building stayed mine. My lawyer, James, helped draw up new leases for the space. Within 6 weeks, 3 small businesses had moved in: a physical therapy practice, a tech consulting firm, and a nonprofit legal clinic. I didn't use the Langley name for any of the paperwork. Riverbend Capital remained on every document. A former employee from the front desk, Denise, sent me an update I hadn't asked for. She still spoke with someone close to my parents, and apparently they'd moved into a 1-bedroom rental in East Hartford, $1,200 a month. Small kitchen, shared laundry in the basement. She said my father had picked up a job managing warehouse shifts at a nearby fulfillment center. Long hours, rotating weekends. My mother had started selling off her jewelry first, the necklace she wore to every family wedding, then the charm bracelet she used to polish at the kitchen table before big events. I read the message twice, then deleted it. There wasn't anything to say. A week later, I stood in the middle of the 3rd-floor unit of the Main Street building. The floors had been polished, the walls repainted, natural light spilled in through the front windows. I was holding the keys to the office I just leased to a young nonprofit director who wanted to expand her youth tutoring program. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Where my mother once held holiday parties with catered hors d'oeuvres and glass bowls of sugared almonds, now sat foldable tables and stacks of learning kits. Tom and I got married in a public park just outside the city. It was a warm Saturday afternoon with low clouds and scattered birdsong. We stood under a rented white tent surrounded by maybe 30 people, just close friends, a few coworkers, and the neighbor who always left flowers on our doorstep. I wore a pale gray dress, sleeveless and simple. Tom wore a blue button-up with no tie. We wrote our own vows. No podium, no microphone, just our voices spoken plainly. After the ceremony, we served iced tea and small sandwiches on picnic tables under the shade of 2 old maples. No speeches, no DJ, just music from a speaker in a tote bag and the kind of conversation that doesn't need to be recorded. By the time we left for the night, the sun had dipped behind the trees and the last guests were waving from the gravel parking lot. Tom helped me fold the chairs into the back of the rental van, and we drove home in silence, tired but calm. The building's rental income came in consistently, $20,000 a month across 4 tenants. I used it to pay off the loan from Brian Coleman earlier than expected. He congratulated me over the phone and said if I ever wanted to invest in something bigger to call him first. I thanked him and meant it. With full ownership secured, I set up an office on the 2nd floor, just a desk, a lamp, and a wall calendar. I called it the Rising Roots Fund. Pamela helped with the setup, paperwork, tax structure, outreach language. She even designed the grant application form. Within weeks, submissions came in. Stories of single parents starting over after leaving unstable homes. Young entrepreneurs trying to get funding after being turned down by their families. Students applying for scholarships after being told they weren't worth the cost of tuition. I read each application carefully. I didn't rush the process. I wanted to make sure I understood not just what they needed, but who they were. The first round of grants went out in July. A small daycare center received funds for outdoor play equipment. A retired carpenter got backing to train apprentices. A college junior secured books and housing for the fall semester. The check amounts were modest, but the impact was real. In August, I hosted a community event in the building's courtyard. Nothing big, just food trucks, folding chairs, and a few poster boards highlighting the grantees. People came. Some brought kids. A local poet read from a new collection. There was lemonade. A few volunteers handed out flyers about next quarter's application window. The air smelled like grilled corn and sunscreen. I stood near the edge of the crowd, not as a host, not as a donor, just as someone watching it unfold. A few weeks after the community event, my neighbor Carol stopped by with a plate of shortbread cookies and a bit of news. She'd seen my mother at the grocery store in East Hartford alone, pushing a cart of off-brand canned goods and discount bread. She looked tired, Carol said quietly, setting the plate on the counter. Not sick, just worn out. I nodded and thanked her, but I didn't ask for more. There was nothing else I needed to know. The truth was, I'd already heard enough through other channels. A former vendor mentioned my father was clocking long shifts at a shipping warehouse on the edge of town. Another neighbor said Derek had been applying for contract work through local staffing agencies, tech support, short-term installs, anything that paid weekly. My parents had canceled their club membership. Derek had sold his car. They were downsizing in every way that mattered. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't mark it on the calendar or talk about it with Tom. It wasn't a victory. It was a consequence. One afternoon, I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of tea and stared out at the building across the street. The sun was low, brushing light across the edges of the new sign above the door, Main Street Commons. A quiet space now filled with new tenants, people working hard to build something from the ground up. I thought about my parents for a moment, about all the times I'd stood in their shadow waiting for permission to take up space. I wondered if I should reach out, not to argue, just to speak. But every time I reached for my phone, I stopped short. I thought about the dinners where I was talked over, the years where my savings became their cushion, the birthday they forgot while planning Derek's launch party, the way they stood in my hallway furious over a rent hike but silent about stolen money. Each memory settled like a weight in my chest. Tom and I went for a walk that evening. The air was cool, the sidewalks quiet. As we crossed a small bridge near the edge of the neighborhood, he asked gently, "Have you thought about calling them?" I didn't answer right away. We walked another block in silence. Then I said, "I've thought about it, but I haven't picked up the phone." He nodded. "Whatever you decide, just make sure it's for you." The next morning I opened my laptop and looked at a draft email I'd started weeks ago. Just a few lines, nothing dramatic, but I deleted it. I didn't need to reopen something that had already been closed. Pamela called around noon that day. She'd run into Derek at the bank, she said. He was cashing a check and looked thinner than she remembered. He hadn't noticed her. Or maybe he had and just chose not to say anything. I thanked her for letting me know. She paused before hanging up and said, "You don't owe anyone anything, Marissa. You know that, right?" I told her I did. Later that week, a grant application came in from a young woman who'd aged out of foster care and was trying to open a small hair studio. She had a business plan, a budget, and a simple request to help with the first 3 months' rent. I forwarded it to my advisory group with a note, "Let's do this one." It was approved in less than a day. The studio opened in a small unit downstairs from my office. On opening day, she brought me a paper bouquet made from curling ribbon and handed me a thank you card that she'd written in silver ink. It sat on my desk for weeks. A few nights later, Carol stopped by again. She brought banana muffins this time and mentioned in passing that she'd heard Derek had picked up a landscaping job outside of town. I nodded. "They don't talk about you anymore," she said, sipping from the mug I handed her. I smiled faintly and changed the subject. That weekend, Tom and I worked in the garden behind our building. We trimmed the hedges and pulled weeds from the corners of the brick path. Around noon, I sat on the back steps and wiped my hands on a towel. Tom came over with a glass of lemonade and sat beside me. "I think I'm done looking back," I said. He didn't say anything, just put his hand over mine and gave a small squeeze. I hadn't sent them a letter. I hadn't extended a branch. I hadn't offered to help cover their rent or groceries, and I wasn't going to. Choosing not to reach out wasn't an act of anger. It was the final piece of a boundary I'd waited too long to draw. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. Some days I arrived early before the tenants unlocked their doors or the sun cleared the tops of the buildings. I'd walk through the quiet halls of Main Street Commons with a coffee in hand, taking in the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scuff of my own footsteps. The air always smelled faintly of paint and copy paper. I never rushed. I liked seeing the place that way, unhurried, unfinished. It reminded me of how far things had come, even if no one else could see it from the outside. The second-floor office had become more than just a workspace. I kept it simple, a wooden desk, 2 guest chairs, a narrow bookcase along the back wall. The Rising Roots Fund had grown slowly but steadily. Every few weeks, another grant went out seed money for a food truck run by Two Sisters Emergency Housing for a student who'd lost support, a microloan for a seamstress trying to reopen after a flood. No one knew the full story behind the fund, and I never offered it. The work spoke loud enough. In late September, I met with a young applicant named Nina, 26, 2 kids, trying to open a bilingual daycare out of a church basement in the South End. She walked in wearing pressed jeans and a button-down shirt, her binder full of licensing forms and schedules clutched against her chest like armor. She spoke plainly, clearly, her voice steady, even when she said nobody wanted to co-sign. "I'm all I've got." I approved her request the next day. By fall, I had paid off every outstanding loan connected to the building. Brian Coleman sent over the final paperwork and a note congratulating me on full ownership. His words were short but thoughtful. He said I had quiet instincts and knew when to move. I kept the letter tucked in the back of my drawer. One evening, I sat by the window in my apartment, watching the city turn blue as the sun went down. Tom was in the kitchen fixing something simple, roasted chicken green beans. I could hear the quiet clink of glass as he moved dishes from the drying rack. I thought about what success used to look like to me, the version I used to chase, the kind that came with job titles, bigger apartments, nicer bags, or nods from people who never saw me before. Now it looked more like balance, a place that ran on rent checks and grant approvals, a garden that didn't bloom perfectly every season, but still returned each year. A marriage where I didn't have to explain why silence sometimes felt like safety. Tom never pressed when I didn't want to talk. He just made space. In early October, I got a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photo. It was from the grand reopening party all those months ago. In the background, my father stood with a drink in his hand, frozen mid-toast. My mother had her head turned, her mouth slightly open, her earrings catching the light. Derek stood off to the side, expression unreadable. The moment right before I spoke. On the back, written in small, unfamiliar handwriting, were 5 words. They saw you that night. I stared at it for a while, unsure of who had sent it or what they meant by it. Eventually, I slipped the photo into a drawer and let it stay there. Not as a reminder, just as proof. Later that week, I walked past a bus stop near Maple and Easton and saw my father standing near the bench, arms crossed, eyes focused on the pavement. He didn't see me. I kept walking. He looked thinner. His jacket was one I recognized from a decade ago, navy wool, the elbow seam slightly worn. I thought of calling out to him, but the moment passed before the thought finished forming. Back at the building, one of the newer tenants stopped me in the hallway to ask about repainting the break room. I told him I'd send over a form. As he walked away, he turned and said, "This place feels different than the last one I was in. People talk to each other here." I nodded. That's the goal. That night, I wrote a small check to cover printing costs for a local advocacy group I'd partnered with over the summer. They sent a postcard the next week with a photo of their team in matching shirts, arms around each other's shoulders. I pinned it on the bulletin board behind my desk. On a quiet Saturday morning, I walked through the side lot of the building and paused near the delivery entrance. The bricks were chipped in places. The side door handle stuck slightly when pulled. The railing needed paint. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I stood there for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of printers starting up chairs, scraping voices rising inside. I didn't move. Sometimes power looks like a key ring in your back pocket. Sometimes it's a building you walk through slowly, unlocking doors you once thought would always stay shut. It was a Tuesday when I stopped by the small print shop across from Main Street Commons. They were helping with flyers for an upcoming grant workshop, and I wanted to check on the layout before they went to press. The owner, a woman named Darlene, had just stepped into the back when a younger employee brought the stack over to the counter. She was maybe 19 with a name tag that read Rachel and a short pink braid tucked behind one ear. As I flipped through the first few pages, she looked up at me and said, "You're the one who runs the grant thing across the street, right?" I nodded. She smiled. "My aunt got one last year for her sewing business. She says it saved her." I thanked her and told her I was glad it helped. She hesitated, then added quietly, "She said you used to be part of that family that owned the building before everything happened." I paused, my hand resting on the corner of the stack. "She said it took a lot to do what you did." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded again gently and said, "Tell her I'm glad she's still sewing." Walking out of the shop, I didn't feel anything triumphant or heavy, just a stillness I hadn't expected, the kind that comes when something finally settles in its place. Later that evening, I was reorganizing a file drawer in the second-floor office when I came across one of the earliest drafts of the eviction notice I'd sent to my parents. The envelope had never been sealed, just folded, a handwritten note clipped to the top, reminding me to double-check the signature formatting. I held it for a moment, then slid it back into the file. I didn't need to see it again. The tenants on the third floor were setting up for a seasonal open house. Someone had strung paper lanterns across the hallway, and I could hear soft music playing through one of the open doors. I walked upstairs to check the fire exit signs and was met by a man I didn't recognize, maybe early 40s, wearing a shirt with the nonprofit's logo on it. He held out a tray with 2 iced cookies and said, "Thanks for keeping this place running." I took one and smiled. "Thanks for making it better." After he walked off, I leaned against the hallway railing and looked down through the glass toward the front doors. 2 kids had come in with their mother, one of them in a red jacket several sizes too big, holding a small flyer in one hand and a plastic truck in the other. They ran ahead toward the sound of music. That night, Tom and I sat on the couch with the windows cracked and the evening breeze drifting in. He asked about the open house, and I told him about the paper lanterns and the iced cookies. He asked if I'd heard anything new from my parents, and I told him no. It had been nearly a year since the grand reopening, since the night I stood in front of a room full of investors and said clearly and calmly that I owned the building. Since then, I hadn't received a single message from my father, my mother, or Derek. No apology. No acknowledgement. Not even a note passed through someone else. Their silence didn't hurt anymore. It just existed like a lamp no one bothered to plug in. I still heard bits and pieces, that they'd missed a few months' rent at their new place, that Derek had started working as a delivery driver, switching routes every few weeks, that my mother had begun sewing again, not for a boutique or a market, just for a neighbor's alterations. Each update came from someone else's mouth, someone else's story. None of it reached me directly. And that felt right. The Rising Roots Fund continued its quiet work. We helped a retired nurse open a caregiving service. A high school senior launched a tutoring network from her parents' garage. A man who had aged out of prison with nowhere to go now had a job and a room in a group home funded by one of our partner grants. People began to leave thank you notes taped to the door of our office, sometimes drawings, sometimes just a sentence written in marker. I saved every one of them, not because they were for me, but because they reminded me why I started. On the last Thursday of the month, we hosted a donor breakfast in the small courtyard behind the building. Nothing fancy, just coffee fruit and a folding table with stacks of printed grant reports. A few of the grantees stopped by to share stories. A woman named Lourdes spoke about how her microloan helped her launch a neighborhood garden cooperative. She ended her short speech by saying, "We don't always need to be rescued. Sometimes we just need a door that isn't locked." I looked across the courtyard at the brick wall where my father's old business sign used to hang. There was nothing left of it now. No hooks, no lettering, no faded outline. Just one long stretch of clean brick and a flowering vine beginning to climb the corner. I don't know when the shift happened exactly. It wasn't a big moment. No sudden relief or loud realization. Just a quiet morning where I looked around and didn't feel the weight of what used to be. I was sitting on the bench outside Main Street Commons, sipping from a paper cup while the first tenants arrived for the day. The street was just waking up delivery vans, pulling in someone unlocking a bike from the rack across the street, a breeze that smelled faintly of rain and warm concrete. And I felt it not pride, not triumph, just a kind of steadiness I hadn't known before. The building was full now, every unit spoken for every lease current. The Rising Roots Fund had doubled its outreach. We were reviewing new applications from as far out as New Haven and Springfield. I'd hired a part-time coordinator named Justine, early 40s, soft-spoken, brilliant with logistics, and she kept things running with a quiet ease I trusted completely. Pamela still helped with the bigger financial reports. Brian Coleman sent a holiday card that year, handwritten. Tom and I found a house a few miles outside Hartford. Nothing big, just a 2-bedroom with a wraparound porch and a small garden that caught the afternoon sun. We didn't rush to fill it. No pressure, no timelines. Just space to breathe and build at our own pace. On Sunday mornings, we'd read in silence or drive out to the farmer's market. Some nights we'd pull up old recipes and cook something neither of us had tried before. It was simple, and it was enough. I never heard from my parents again. No letter, no call, no apology. Derek didn't reach out either. That part of my life went quiet like a radio station gone out of range. I didn't chase after it. I didn't need to. What they did and didn't do had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I think for a long time I believed justice had to be loud, a confrontation, a takedown. But the truth is, justice can be quiet. Sometimes it's just reclaiming the pieces of yourself that were chipped away and choosing day by day not to give them back. Sometimes it's building something better in the very place where someone told you you'd never succeed. That's what this building became for me. Not a trophy, not revenge, just proof that I could create something meaningful without their permission. A place where other people could come and start fresh. A place where being overlooked didn't mean you were forgotten. If you're still listening, thank you. I know not every story has a perfect ending, but maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe all it needs is a moment of peace, a window that opens quietly after years of being stuck shut. And if you've ever felt invisible or dismissed, just know you're not alone. You don't have to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. Build your own place. Define your own legacy. You're allowed to begin again on your terms. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment or share your own journey. And if you're still on your way there, that's okay too. You'll get there. One step at a time.